What is sustainability, and how did we get here today? In order to answer this question, I will provide a brief history of environmentalism in hopes of clearing up widespread misconceptions regarding sustainability. First, it is crucial to consider cultural programming. Who people are, what they believe, and how they behave are greatly influenced by the social context in which they develop. No matter how much we attempt to alter individual level behaviors, things in general will not turn in a different direction unless cultural mindset changes. The dominant social paradigm of Western industrialism stems from ideologies of manifest destiny, in which progress equals growth. The mindset in which man is separate from nature and should control nature stems back for centuries, from early Rome, where Plato and Aristotle proposed the great chain of being, stating that there was a scale to which certain animals were closest to God, with man at the top, providing the platform for anthropocentrism, leading into early Judeo-Christianity and the vilification of paganism and animism, instilling fear of nature and the belief that nature is wicked or even evil. Then the separation of man went a step further with the progress of early scientism coined by Sir Francis Bacon, who removed variables and reduced nature into parts and elements. The widespread adoption of reducing nature into separate parts through industrial capitalism has shown that tremendous advances in technology and dramatic population growth would ultimately lead to impending ecological collapse. Capitalism promises that individuals have a right to maximize economic gain. What capitalism doesn't account for is the fact that the Earth is a finite system which has reached its carrying capacity for human growth. If population equals growth in a finite space, then clearly we find ourselves in a conundrum. The dominant social paradigm, which separates man from nature and generally exploits the planet, is not a prescription for all Westerners. Emerson and Thoreau became the first American transcendentalist writers in the early 19th century. At Walden Pond, Thoreau wrote, "In wilderness is the preservation of the world," becoming an icon as the call of the first Western man to challenge the dominant social paradigm. John Muir pioneered environmentalism into the 20th century, creating a distinction between preservation and conservation. Muir was able to define the argument, is nature to be conserved or preserved, which still holds true today. Are we merely conserving land for it to be exploited and used in the future under manifest destiny? Or are we preserving nature for the sake of maintaining something pristine and untouched by man so that we may never exploit or destroy it in the interests of capitalist growth? With the friendship of Teddy Roosevelt, Muir was able to form the Sierra Club, trying to protect the Hetch Hetchy Valley of northern Yosemite from being a reservoir to supply water to San Francisco. Muir was ultimately unsuccessful as the walls of the dam were built and the valley was eventually flooded. In the urban areas of the 19th century, under a new form of industrial development and growth, people became concerned with the water quality as a result of toxic waste dumping. This sparked the feud between the reformers and the professionals. Reformers, who can be equated to preservationists, fundamentally challenged the industrial paradigm. Meanwhile, professionals maintained that science, engineering, and technology can help solve the problems which science, engineering, and technology created in the first place. The professionals, being a clear example of buying into a progress trap can be described as an ideology in which the same technologies which create a problem can also solve that problem. In the early 20th century, ecological concerns were still a relatively new idea. World War I was put at the forefront of public concern, placing ecological concerns on the back burner. The business boom of the Roaring Twenties placed a blindfold of another decade over the eyes of the general public. The Great Depression of the 1930s, although it was rooted in ecological crisis, only further relegated environmental concerns lower on the totem pole. Roosevelt's New Deal birthed the Civilian Conservation Crew, which was the first of its kind, as a federally mandated program for the efforts of conservation. The CCC eventually became the National Parks and Forest Service. In the 1940s, Aldo Leopold had just written a Sand County Almanac. In 1945, the post-World War II efforts began. Leaving Leopold in the shadows, Aldo Leopold proposed the land ethic, in which nature has an inherent value. Leopold further asserted that nature has the right to exist, rather than just being of use to humans. In light of the Sand County Almanac, people did what they do and started buying cars and TVs. Advertisements for plastic knickknacks to make housewives' lives easier sparked the American dream. Companies that were once making bombs are now making fertilizer, leading to the mass development of petrochemicals in the 1950s. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring took hold in the 1960s, when President Kennedy acknowledged the threat which DDT presented to the bald eagle. Anti-authoritarian public leaders emerged in the 1960s, along with the LSD movement, and this is where we see the emergence of hippie culture. Radical movements, such as Friends of the Earth, begin to pop up. In 1970, the first Earth Day, in which about 20 million people marched down Fifth Ave in New York City as a mass outcry for public sentiment against environmental degradation. The 1970s were known as the Green Decade. This decade produced the EPA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. President Ford established 18 national parks during the 1970s. In the 1980s, President Carter established the Department of Energy, the Soil and Water Conservation Act, and a few others, but most importantly, the Superfund Act, which gave the EPA control over cleaning up toxic waste sites. Carter's legacy of solar panels on top of the White House represented an iconic moment in the history of environmentalism and sustainability, when the first thing his successor Ronald Reagan did in his presidency was tear them off the roof. The environmentalist movement of the 60s, 70s, and early 80s was almost single-handedly dismantled by Ronald Reagan by promoting neoliberal capitalism. Neoliberal capitalism is a system of global corporate privatization of natural resources. Reagan was able to satisfy the short-term needs of the American public by promising economic prosperity and the environmental dream at the expense of future generations, turning environmentalism into a full-time lobbying profession in D.C. Reagan helped put the demands of the corporate interests over environmental concerns. As a response to Reagan's neoliberal CIA politics, Earth First and the Wise Use Agenda became outlets of nonviolent direct action. Civil disobedience such as monkey wrenching, eco-terrorism, and other forms of sabotage became the new methods of protecting the Earth. Reagan's successor was his puppet master, President George H.W. Bush, a Republican whose political slogan was one of the greatest greenwashings of all time, declaring himself the environmental president. After Republican George H.W. Bush, we got Democratic nominee Bill Clinton and his running mate Al Gore. Eventually teeter-tottering back to the Republican Bush Jr., then the pendulum swung to Democrat Obama, to Republican Trump, to Democrat Biden. The switch back and forth from Republican to Democrat is the same as going from preservationist to conservationist. In this back and forth cycle of Republican to Democrat, one Democrat president will strengthen an act in one term, and the next Republican president will butcher it. A Democrat protects an area through conservation so that a Republican drill for oil in the same place during the next presidency. In politics, making friends out of enemies is business as usual. Politicians are only allegiant to their bank accounts. To assume that any political efforts are in the name of preservation would be naive. The nature of capitalism requires continual expansion due to the fact that Western banking is a pyramid scheme run by bankers and politicians. It appears that there is no room for preservation under the neoliberal capitalist model which we operate under today. Yet preservation is the only escape from the progress trap which we currently find ourselves in, bouncing back and forth from Republican to Democrat. It is crucial to consider the cultural programming. Who people are, what they believe, and how they behave are greatly influenced by the social context in which they develop. No matter how much we attempt to alter individual level behaviors, things in general will not turn in a different direction unless cultural mindset changes.